let's open up the discussion. People may have questions. Let me start off with one as you kind of perhaps get your notes together. But we should have a good discussion, argument. There's maybe differences in kind of scholarly approaches to classes we can explore, but there are broader issues too. Let me start off by asking the panel here a question that many of you raised. Some of us are involved in military education directly. Tony, you're up at the War College. Chris, John, you guys have taught. Obviously, Dr. Kiesling, you are at West Point. From Clausewitz's perspective, what should our officers, our leaders in training be reading and studying? What should the curriculum be? And if you have a sense that it should differ from perhaps what is the curriculum today, I'd be eager to hear that. So perhaps from your perspective, if Clausewitz were designing the curriculum for professional military education in the 21st century, what would he be telling us to be doing? Do we want to make an effort? I know that Alan, you have some strong views about kind of more disciplines you come into the military with, so maybe you can start and then we'll go with other.
In terms of the backgrounds of training people?
Sure, I mean, what kind of educational background, or if maybe they don't have it, they get it while they're here, right? So,
well, I think that people do need training in the sciences, of course. That's fundamental to the way our world operates today. And my claim a few minutes ago about Clausewitz was that we need to think about war is more organic than mechanistic. Now, war's not a living thing, but it's more akin to living things, and is akin to what Clausewitz at one point referred to as dead stuff, Totenstoff, right, inanimate matter. And therefore, I think that we do need more biologists in service, in training, and in the background, but not just because of Clausewitz, because of the future of war. I think that we are creating more and more entities, we human beings, not just the Pentagon or the Defense Department or anybody else in the military in some other part of the world. We human beings are creating more and more entities that have increasingly the attributes of living things. Whether we're talking about drones, swarming things, whether we're talking about AI, that petition just recently of about 1,000 people, scientists, inventors, engineers, mathematicians, including Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Bill Gates. A number of people signed saying we should worry about AI because we're potentially developing our biological competitors on this planet. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But I'm talking about even things that don't have sentience. We're developing sensors and other kinds of devices that basically could at some point interanimate one another. That's my word. That's not a word that other people use. But they could interanimate one another in ways that we don't anticipate, do not want, have not planned for, didn't program it in, but they could interanimate each other in ways that could surprise us potentially very negatively. And I think that we don't understand that because most people in the physical sciences and engineering fields believe if you design something and if you create it, you control it. I remember asking someone who was in robotics about this, a fellow at MIT, a very well-known roboticist, and I remember saying, well, what makes you think you control these things? And he says, of course we'll control them, we're the creators. And I said, oh, like parents? And he said, yeah, like that.
Or God.
Okay, so that tells you the problem we're facing among people who are in the design business, who are in the implementation of these devices, that are developing more and more characteristics of living things. They're not living yet. The main characteristic of a living thing is that it can die. Pretty simple. That's not trivial, because when things can die, they strive not to. When they strive not to, they do two things, two strategies. One is they adapt to their environment. The second is they adapt their environment to themselves. Either of those could become a problem for us. So I think that, as I phrased it in October, we have a blind spot in the armed forces, in the officer corps in particular, but among people who make decisions, the commanders, decision makers, policy makers. We have a blind spot in that we are lacking this biological dimension to our thinking, and that blind spot constitutes a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is an invitation to trouble. So that's as succinctly as I can say what I think about what we need, because people bring their experiences to their life, to their education, and the feedback process that education is all about.
Chris, please don't change.
Oh, I was just going to say, West Point has actually made a curricular change which
Yes.
you might find interesting.
I understand people just went to the Air Force Academy to try to get some more information about the biology major the Air Force Academy has.
Yeah. Tell us more about what's happening at West Point.
Well, this year's plebe class will be the first plebe class ever to take biology, or at some point. That's been added to the curriculum. I don't know when they're going to take it. I know nothing about that. So I think...
First one ever.
Yeah, I think this is
A sex ed class?
That's different.
What drove that decision at West Point to make biology a required class?
I'm not privy to that, but whoever, it was a good idea.
Yes.
And I think it's a really important move. On the other hand, and this was not the only change, they have eliminated one semester of military history. So this will also be the first class that only has one semester of military history. And I think Clausewitz would feel that that was not a good move, and I would agree with him.
That's interesting. That's right. Chris, you were leaning forward. You want to say something?
Well, I just immediately responded to Alan. I have a strategy course that I teach at Chasoma, and it centers on modern evolutionary theory because the logic or the character of evolution in the real world is the logic of the universe, and it applies to human behavior and the behavior of states, behavior of political entities in general. And I get very positive response to it. What I generally get is a sort of, my God, I never thought that this applied to anything real. And so I would argue that, national security professionals should be very eclectic. But I'll tell you that educating engineers is notoriously difficult because they have this linear mindset, and it takes a lot of effort to get people who are, think in that environment. It's very hard to get them to deal with the organic character of political entities. So I would definitely stress history first, because that's about human beings. Biology second, because that's about the way the universe really operates. And then I just said, beyond that, study whatever you can, or whatever's interesting. Be very eclectic. Clausewitz is extremely eclectic. And because that's the only way you can put together any kind of holistic view of the world, and you have to struggle your whole life trying to get coherence out of that. But if you stovepipe yourself, you're not going to be able to deal with the real world.
That's helpful. Tony, let me ask you a question. At the War College, you're seeing the Army's senior leaders, not only the Army's, but the Joint Force senior leaders, the interagency senior leaders as well. You're there teaching Clausewitz. What's the reception? Do people get it? Do they find this tedious 200-year-old kind of thing like reading Plato? They're not really sure it's relevant and it's important, but they're not tracking. Tell me how they...
It's mixed, and the dean of the War College is right in the front row. I don't put them on the spot anymore, they already have, but he may want to chime in at some point. I think it does vary from class to class. I would say we need greater historical awareness. There just isn't enough of that. So there's a great deal, I think, of historical ignorance. So we need to do that a little bit more. We do push the nature of war, a section of the course that talks about that, not just from Clausewitz' perspective, but from others. I think that's important. The reception of the interest in Clausewitz depends a great deal on what's happening in the contemporary world and whether people see any kind of linkages or not. So it kind of ebbs and flows. Class at present appears, in my opinion, to be pretty engaged with it. So.
I do think the ebbs and flows and the interest in Clausewitz is itself an interesting phenomenon that you might want to ask people about in this
Yes,
group.
okay, absolutely. Before we leave the education question, let me ask you, sir, if I could. When we were doing a lot of the personnel reforms that I've been involved in the Pentagon, a small team doing it was already, well, it's a great book, I would also recommend to you, The Cognitive Challenge of War, that he wrote about not only Clausewitz, but the entire milieu of which he was a part, from 1806 to 1815. It's a really terrific book about this. And you've also written the definitive biography of Clausewitz, and many essays that talk about some of the other Kleist and some of these other figures who were very important in other fields, but were contemporaries of his in the Army and went out to become playwrights and such. So what do you think if Clausewitz were here today in the 21st century? What would he be recommending that we read and study? You've written about film and literature. You yourself have broad interest in the arts. What would Clausewitz tell our officers? Like, you should study this. What do you think he would say?
I think whether he would say it or just think it, he would always want to expand and destroy any limits. So he, rather than say, yes, you need to have a semester on this or semester on that, he would suggest that people think and study as broadly as possible. And I'm thinking about something that he wrote when he was a prisoner in France in 1807. And he was writing to the woman whom he would eventually marry. And he said, here we were, and we were concentrated in our activities, which was to defeat the enemy. And then we were defeated ourselves, and we were captured. And now the world that we had created in order to deal with it has now come apart. So what do we do? And and he said, well, I've started to study mathematics, and after that I'm going to study physical and medical sciences. He had met somebody who was a physician and had become interested in it. And so he goes from one thing to another. He simply wants to learn and trust on his own creative ability to put these things together into some kind of instrument that helps him go through this very difficult time. Just imagine, a similarity would be if this country had suddenly been defeated in a major war, was now occupied. How do you deal with that? Well, I think you deal with it by first strengthening yourself as much as possible to enable you to help recreate or to create a new future. And I think it's not a recipe, but he always comes back, doesn't he, on the individual. What the individual may be able to do with his own potential. It's never enough, but he should do with it as much as he can. And then,
Maybe pick up Alan's question then about the reception of Clausewitz, which I know, Chris, you've written about. Your translation hit at a very propitious time, coming out of Vietnam. Not long after, you have Harry Summers write a book that tries to apply Clausewitz to Vietnam. Now we have, in the last couple of years, Emil Simpson will be coming in January to talk to the group about Clausewitz in Afghanistan. So the question I have perhaps is, why did this suddenly become part of the canon, which seems to be a post-Vietnam phenomenon for Americans? Why do you think it took on such a resonance here that we now would be talking about it to this day? Was there something that happened in American life that made this kind of a moment where Clausewitz had his time in the shining light?
I'm not the right kind of person to answer that. You can understand that much better than I. I would just think that, first of all, I wonder how solid, how widespread the canon really is. Basically, Clausewitz is a name, and most people have not read him, are not going to read him. And so he's a kind of minor cultural hero, perhaps. It certainly would be in Germany. But I think it's inevitable that at a time when we have so many terribly serious political and military problems, which are really difficult ones, and there's no real agreement, I think at least, how to solve these problems. It's only natural that one looks back and hopes for help from the past. And as I say, I think the help that the past can offer is not recipes, definite actions, but the use of intelligence and information. Bring that together in your own way and see where it takes you. I mean,
That's very helpful.
What else can we do?
Yeah, very good. John, before we to Jim, let me ask you a question. I mean, you came to, well, really military history. I know we talked about protesting against the Vietnam War, and you're very strong interest in that area. Why do you think that Clausewitz has gotten traction in kind of American national security studies? Do you have any theories about that?
I don't have any theories about that. I think Chris Basford's book covers that territory. I would like to say that it has been said here that On War is a terrible book. I don't find it to be a terrible or a bad book. I mean, I find it to be a very good book.
So do I, but
extraordinary.
it's a very difficult book.
Yeah, but it's an extraordinary book. The more you read it, it's a book unlike any other book that I know. It's a book that, I mean, it appears to be putting forward ideas and concepts, but it's not doing that. I think it's almost an intellectual autobiography by someone who saw reality. And the more you read it, I mean, in order to connect with Clausewitz, you have to understand that properly read, it's evoking that reality that he experienced, and that's what makes it such an extraordinary book. That he had. If you think of the battles that it was in, from Jena Auerstadt through Wavre, and all the battles in between, and the kind of mass killing he saw in Russia. And at the same time, his access to the very highest reaches of politics, either directly in his association with the king and through his wife. I can't think of anyone else with that range of experience and that depth of experience.
Well, this is a very important point because Clausewitz doesn't talk about himself much in his work. In his book on the Waterloo campaign, which he was very much in, he was a Corps Chief of Staff, he doesn't mention any of his own perceptions or his own experiences. If you were to spend your time doing what I said earlier, go back and reread, revisit Clausewitz on war, you could very well end up just spinning your wheels. If you just look at On War, first of all, Clausewitz wrote a lot of other stuff, but secondly, there's a huge literature about Clausewitz, pro and frankly, all modern military theory from the publication of On War is written in the shadow of Clausewitz. We think of Jomini as being Clausewitz's opposite. The book that Jomini wrote that we talk about was written after Jomini read On War. And it's a completely different book from the one Clausewitz criticizes. But you need to know something about the man, you need to know something about his context, the European-wide context, and the specifically Prussian context. Who is this guy, and what are the problems he's in, what specific experiences does he shape his life? But there's this enormous literature. If you go to the Clausewitz homepage, if you go to the English language bibliography, it takes a long time to page through that. There's an enormous literature, much of it really bad. Right? And of course, there's a very large German literature, and we have that too. And you do need to be researching around Clausewitz, as well as reading a whole lot of other stuff. I mean, you do not want to be a person of one book, but Clausewitz will help you integrate everything that you look at, I think.
Well, let me ask perhaps that question, and then I'm looking for hands here too. There are people who, I think the strategist Colin Gray is one of them. He say, I'm a Clausewitzian. And you occasionally hear that around the Pentagon and people who write about military strategy saying, I'm a Clausewitzian. I asked the panel, what does that mean exactly? It seems to imply when people say it that
He's a claim to have read it.
they read it, or it means they have like a hard-edged realism to them, right? It's kind of what it means, kind of this, I'm kind of like a, have a very cold, gimlet-eyed view of the world kind of approach. Right? That seems to be what they mean by it. But again, I think there are people who do consider themselves Clausewitzian. I'd be curious to know, and perhaps starting with you, Dr. Bray, if someone says I'm a Clausewitzian, what would you take that to mean?
I try not to be nasty. And I certainly don't consider myself a Clausewitzian. And here was an extremely intelligent, very creative man who lived in a most challenging time and made something out of his life. And what he was interested in was to try to understand some of the general public issues that also affected him personally. For instance, the creation of Prussia into, or the growth of Prussia from a royal principality into a community with certain shared values, shared by the highest to the lowest, that sort of thing. And so, in a sense, he's an early Republican. He is for eliminating social demands for positions. For instance, you don't have to be a nobleman in order to get a commission, and so on. He wants to improve society, but he doesn't do it in a highly formal, disciplined way. He does it as one human being who tries to think things out for himself. I mean, that's a very nice model to follow, and if that's what it means to be a Clausewitzian, that's the equivalent of an independent-minded, relatively intellectual, certainly intelligent human being who means well. Wouldn't go beyond that.
So what does that mean? Does anybody else want to offer up? And Tony, there are people in the Army who think of themselves as Clausewitzian.
Amongst our students, if someone were to say that, what they mean is they are not Yominian. They look at one or the other, sort of, and they have, in some ways, oversimplified view of Yomini, I'm sure.
Maybe you can summarize what that means. Okay, if someone says, I'm not a Yominian, I'm
You're
a
right, they're not going to
Clausewitzian.
follow
What's-
the list, they're not looking for concrete answers to every problem, kind of thing, that approach. And they embrace the idea of complexity of war, fog, friction, all of those things that are tied up in that.
And do they think there are Eumenians around? I mean, because to say you're a Clausewitzian is to contrast yourself with someone, right?
Yeah.
Are they saying that, hey, out there are Eumenians still who like actually believe that there's a rule?
I do feel that we are perhaps too loose with the term we're Clausewitzian, because we tend to fall into a very route step sort of approach to modeling and waging war, thinking about war. On the other hand, it's difficult to have it the other way. How are you going to control vast armies and navies, air forces, to get some kind of objective accomplished on the ground without putting in strict controls in some way or the other? I mean, this debate is part of the war being an art or a science debate that is throughout the 19th century into the 20th century and still today. So to what extent can you afford to just call yourself a Clausewitzian and dive into an individualist approach to thinking about war and understanding war? At some point you've got to have military units and a hierarchy that embraces a similar concept so you can move in unison to get something. So there's a difficult tension there. I think we aren't really wrestling with enough energy.
Jim?
Oh, I'm much nastier than Peter.
Okay,
When
please.
somebody says I'm a Clausewitzian, I'm afraid I translate that as I'm smarter than you are. It's usually the way people begin a conversation to achieve intellectual dominance, which, as I said in October, I think that's why the Army adopted Clausewitz in 73 and the Navy Thucydides, is to achieve intellectual dominance over the politicians. But more specifically, I'm a Clausewitzian means that I believe war is a tool of policy. Policy is rational, and cultural stuff doesn't matter. And if people are being too cultural, then they're not talking about war, they're talking about something that isn't really war. And if they're going to do something that isn't war, it's not my problem, because I'm in the business of dealing with war as Clausewitz defines it. Sorry, that's kind of nasty, but
That's very helpful. I mean, I guess the way I was suggesting on this, now kind of the current one to you, Mark, was that, right, if you look at Vietnam, you have the, I guess, hypothesis that it was like, how did this not go quite like we wanted it to? Because we won all of the battlefield conflicts. And it was the link to policy, right, that Clausewitz said, hey, it was the policy that was wrong here. All right, that kind of explains. So I just was trying to see if anyone would agree with this notion. It was the
It
Vietnam
provides an
experience
excuse,
that-
and John, I think, mentioned this, that it provides a handy excuse for the military coming out of Vietnam that, hey, you know, you never beat us on the battlefield, as Harry Summers said, and the Vietnamese diplomat says, yeah, so what? I think they're wrong. First of all, they did beat us on the battlefield on numerous occasions, but not on in the big stuff. We were just too massive, powerful for that. But you asked the question earlier, why does Clausewitz go in and out of fashion? And I think it's really interesting, and I think I mentioned this when I spoke earlier. I have a slide I like to throw up that says Clausewitz is for losers. All right? And then I track through the Clausewitz blowing in and out of fashion historically. You know, his book came out in 1832, 35, 37. And it made a splash in Germany, but it faded. And it really comes back into sharp focus in Germany, and Prussia in particular, after the revolutions of 1848, in which the Prussian army was humiliated. And it's the point that when you're winning, we don't need a stinking Clausewitz. That's a difficult book, and we're doing okay. It's when you're losing, or when things are not going well. So Clausewitz somebody famously said that the French are not interested in any military theory that is not French, but especially if it is Prussian. Right? Well, after 1871, they're very interested in Clausewitz. The British, you know, there's a British translation of Clausewitz in 1873, which sells 9 copies a year, all right, until the Boer War. The British win that, with 500,000 men on the ground in South Africa. And the British Army is very conscious that maybe we don't know what we're doing. And all of a sudden, sales of Clausewitz and the issues of new editions of Clausewitz takes off. So by the time of 1914, the British are, you know, the front page of the New York Times, or the London Times has advertisements for On War, and it's a bigger advertisement than all the other ones. The Americans pay no attention to Clausewitz. You know, I mean, broadly speaking. You get Patton reading him in 1910, and he goes back, gets a better translation, reads it in 1926. Eisenhower reads it and says later, this is the most important thing I ever read. But American military institutions, absolutely uninterested. American Army doctrine in the 30s explicitly rejects the notion that strategy should be affected by politics. All we ask is that once the policy is clear, the professionals be allowed to come up with strategy and win the war. It is Vietnam and the confusion, demoralization, humiliation, the way that the people of the Army, the government, Summers' version of, and Summers' very defective version of Clausewitz's Trinity, is because those 3 elements really came apart in the United States. And that accounts, I think, for the rise and fall in Clausewitz's popularity. And right now, I personally have been a little puzzled by the massive outburst in Clausewitz studies the last several years. And it is, of course, because we are so stunned at what's happened to us over the last 15 years. And, you know, Peter said something earlier about the state and Clausewitz. And I think it's very important. I think a big part of our problem is we don't really understand the state. And I would disagree with him a little bit in that, yes, Clausewitz expected, you know, he was working on insurgencies that would support the state. But that's always been the case. You know, insurgents, successful insurgents become the state. Mao was a Clausewitz, and Mao, to use that word, and Mao always thought the Communist Party of China was the legitimate state, even when it wasn't. And of course, that state is the state in China. So I don't think that there's this disconnect. The danger is thinking that Clausewitz represents only state warfare, state-on-state warfare, and that's false.
But Clausewitz really challenges in his own case. I mean, his own state. I mean, in 1812. I mean, he resigns his commission in the Prussian army, and he goes over to the Russians, and
With the permission of the king.
Yes, well, but he's still placed in the position of fighting against an invading force which includes his own brothers. I mean, it seems to me that this is an extraordinary act by a serving Army officer to switch armies. And, you know, I mean, I must say that during the I was opposed to the Vietnam War. I wasn't on the side of the North Vietnamese, but I was opposed to the actions of the United States government, and emphatically so. Reading, actually Clausewitz in the State, which related Clausewitz's ambivalence towards his own government, was something that drew me into the study of Clausewitz.
But to oppose the actions of your state is not the same as to oppose your state. Clausewitz is still a fan of the Prussian state. He just wants it to do the right thing.
Right, and I think one has to separate Clausewitz's biography from his treatment of war On War. On War does not treat war of the type that we are now faced with. And that is to say, his vision is definitely one of organized political entities clashing. And it's not a criticism of Clausewitz that, no, but I say these are the facts. We are now dealing with a different kind of war, not the only war we deal with, but that particular kind is one that he did not in any organized fashion discuss. And that's I wouldn't call that a flaw on war. I think it's just a fact. At the time that he wrote, those wars were really very, very insignificant. I think we could find examples of them, but as I said before, he did spend a lot of time discussing popular movements, but the popular movements were always linked with an organized political entity. So we're dealing today with something that's rather different. But his personal life, he acted as an individual with principles and ideas, and he followed them, even if it meant leaving Prussia. Right. That is not directly reflected in his theoretical writings.
Colonel, please.
Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, Joint Staff Lessons Learned. It's been great fun and a privilege to be able to ask each of you a question during your individual sessions. One word I don't think we've heard today was ethics. Certainly there's ethics in the conduct of war and military leadership and the civil-military relations. What does Clausewitz have to offer us in regards to ethics?
It's not. He does in the introductory chapters talk about ethics, but then leaves them alone. There they are, and they certainly have political and psychological impact. But he does not then discuss them at great length. Throughout the book, you will see references to these topics, but they are not a major issue. And I'm trying to think whether in his correspondence there are references to the treatment of prisoners. There are one or two. But I mean, it is not a part of his analysis. He obviously is in favor of decent treatment, but it does not become an element, a clearly defined and developed element in his theoretical writings. I can't think of any. Can you? Are you?
We're dealing with the civilian population as such.
Yeah.
That's not
Well,
a major thing.
if you read his correspondence with Marie, for instance, during the Waterloo campaign, he writes Marie a couple of really kind of hot, racy, romantic letters. But he's commenting on the suffering of the troops, the suffering of the civilian population. Clausewitz personally is very nice man. He's really pretty much untouched by scandal. He's deeply in love with his wife. He's a nice person, a reserved, quiet personality. But I think that he would place the entire ethical issue in the realm. It's a political policy issue that doesn't have a great deal of relevance, and perhaps that's because of the nature of warfare in his time. It doesn't have a great deal of relevance to the issue of the conduct of military operations, which is what the book's about. The book's not about the nature of the state, the nature of human nature, the nature of reality. It's about the conduct of military operations in war. And it's just the mark of its profundity that the moment you start engaging Clausewitz, you start having to engage with issues of human nature and what is politics and what is the state. But these are not his subjects.
If I can follow, I was just going to say a quick follow-up. You mentioned the Trinity and not applying the Trinity earlier. It seems like, especially today, ethics kind of ignores that connection between the conduct of war and the rest of the Trinity, the way we approach CIVCAS or how we expect our military leaders to react to our civilian leaders when they disagree with policy certainly plays into the Trinity. And I'm sorry, I stepped on.
Oh, no, go ahead. Your question, after all. I would actually disagree with Chris, but I think ethics are important to Clausewitz, but from a different point of view. He doesn't talk about ethics specifically, but there's a word he uses that we would be surprised to find, I think. We would expect more ethics and less honor and glory. And he uses the word trophies several times. He talks about how do you know when you won a battle? You get the trophies, meaning you captured guns and colors. And what I'm suggesting here is that this is an 18th, 18th century view of the world. And I think he understands that you fight for honor, you fight for glory, you fight for trophies, and there's an ethical system that's inherent in that he doesn't have to talk about, because you don't get glory from war if you don't behave according to a certain ethical culture.
Mark, you had your hand up? Bill.
Sure. Guilty as charged. I've definitely walked around this building saying I'm a Clausewitzian. What I'm referring to is that I think that there's often a lack of appreciation on the connection policy, politics, politique, and military action. And I find myself almost every day engaging in this, just in discussions. And so I'm curious from the panel, with the character of war in the 21st century, not just the complexity, but I'm thinking about global strike, global social, the movement of global social media, the complexity of insurgency. Is there no longer a continuum here? Are we talking about a time where every tactical action has a political implication that needs to be addressed by senior leadership? Now, I know a lot of my colleagues in uniform would say, you're in our business way too much, and I'm sensitive to that. I think at times there are reasons for it, and I'm looking for some guidance and some thoughts on that.
Well, I would respond that first and foremost, Clausewitz does not see a big dividing line between politics and the conduct of war. That is, every war issues from political purposes. There's a feedback loop from whatever happens on the battlefield back into the political process. He talks about that, how the means affect the ends in multiple occasions. And for people to especially develop this temporal continuum, first you have politics, then you've got war, then you've got politics again afterward, is definitely not Clausewitzian. Everything in war has some political dimension to it, because you cannot separate the means from the ends. It's this interaction issue again. And so if you were going to lay out a continuum and color politics maybe with a bar line like this, right, and color war with a bar line like that, you'd have a big checkered area. But politics, war, politics. Politics is right through war, even if you this way, and war would be this. So you'd have this hash section with politics still there even while you're fighting. Because he doesn't mean by politics just partisan politics. He means the exercise of power.
Yeah, right.
It's not just, political party politics. He's talking about the exercise of power by the state, by the leadership of the state, by the military leadership. Military leaders have political power. That's why in this country we vet higher leaders. You don't become a flag officer. You don't get major command without political imprimatur. People have to actually approve because we want to have civilian control of the military. That's actually quite Clausewitzian, right? In that sense, in the sense you were just describing it. Because for Clausewitz, there is no time when war is totally divorced from politics. It can't happen. The only reason you're fighting is because of some political purpose.
I was trying to think of references, ethical references, not on war, but in his correspondence and the service correspondence. And he's clearly aware, and one would expect him to be aware, of the importance of treatment of civilians and prisoners. And that comes out quite clearly in 1813 when, for a few months, he is chief of staff of a mixed Russian-Prussian force which fights at the very northern part of Germany, away from the major decisions, and against a French force which still occupies German towns, and civilians and soldiers are constantly mixed. And he's concerned about the impact of civilian suffering on military operations, and tries to keep things as neat and clean as he possibly can. But I don't see that reflected in a theoretical treatment and on war. I think he takes it for granted. Do you think?
And I would also think that if you want to go to that topic one more time, that Clausewitz would have been thinking in Kantian terms about the Kantian moral imperatives that Kant had made popular in Germany, accepted by most learned people, that you should act as if you were basically casting a vote of one for everybody else to do what you're doing. You should treat other people as not just a means, but as also an end at the same time. Their humanity should be treated as an end. Those are things that were common currency. And my guess is that Clausewitz would just accepted those as common currency.
Right, and in the lectures, if you go back a few years, in the lectures that he gave on the Little War in 1810 and 1811, he discusses the treatment, again, of not only the treatment, but the taking of prisoners, and partisans disappearing in the population, and the problems that presents to organized forces. And the ethical issue is always clear. He does not believe in executing hostages and things of that kind. But he does not, I cannot think of any extensive discussion of the subject in his theoretical writings. They certainly occur in the histories, but not in the theory.
Well, are we talking about ethics here, or are we talking about politics? Practically, you don't want to piss off the population. You don't want to anger your even your enemies unnecessarily. I mean, when Bernadotte is captured by the Swedes, or no, I'm sorry, the other way around. Bernadotte, French General Bernadotte, captures the Swedish army and spends months partying with the Swedish officers, and he ends up being king of Sweden as a result. But is that ethics? Or is that politics? Yes. One of the biggest problems with Clausewitz, in the discussion of Clausewitz, and you can go in circles forever and get nowhere with Clausewitz. You take war as a continuation of politique, however you want to translate that by other means. If you don't have a definition of politics, well, you get nowhere. If war is a continuation of X and you haven't solved for X yet, you've accomplished nothing. And I frequently annoy my colleagues by asking them, I'm a little fuzzy on this politics thing. Because if you translate politique as policy, that leads you down a very different path than if you translate it as politics. And then I ask, well, what's the difference? And I get a stare and kind of announce that it's break time. But you need to work that out in your head. I mean, that's of fundamental importance if you're going to be an effective citizen. but you're not going to get anywhere with Clausewitz' political concepts until you have a clear idea, even if it's different from his, until you have a clear idea in your own head what policy is and how it differs from policy.
Well, on that note, let me just say I have to regrettably truncate our conversation. The room is needed in a few minutes by the Sergeant Major for the Joint Staff, and if anything a Prussian would appreciate is respect for the Sergeant Major. Thank you all for being here. It's been great fun for me to read the entire book with many of you here, younger officers across the services, and we've been honored by the scholarship and presence of all of the panel members. So Jenny Kiesling, John Cerita, Chris Bass, Logan Echeverria, Alan Byersham, and Peter Perret. Thank you for making the effort. As Major Winiger said, there will be overflow into the food court here. So if you still have questions and comments, I'm sure people will be eager to talk. I know many of the panelists are eager to engage with people from the services to talk about these really important issues. So please, thank you. Please join me in giving a round of applause.